I can't believe I have to make this video. On November 6, 2024, I woke up to a changed world. It was one of my work from home days, so my alarm was set for my sleep-in time of 7:30. On days when I go into the office, I have to get up at 5, so I was looking forward to a relatively calm and lazy morning without the rush of having to get out the door and catch my train on time. The US elections had been happening the night before, but I hadn't stayed up to watch them. I'd gone to bed feeling hopeful and confident that Kamala would win, and I figured the results wouldn't be in for a few days anyway, so there was no need to lose sleep over it. At 6:30 a.m., I woke up to go to the bathroom. The sun was just starting to rise, and a dull gray light was streaming in from between the blinds on my window. I glanced at my phone, saw the time, and felt relieved that I could still go back to sleep for another hour. On the way to the bathroom, I grabbed my phone off the nightstand. I'll just quickly check the results, I thought to myself. It'll be nice to see Kamala in the lead, and then I can wake up feeling happy and excited and ready for my day. Then there it was. Donald Trump, projected winner of US election. I stared at my phone screen, my sleep-fogged brain struggling to comprehend what I was looking at. My first thought was, this isn't real. I must have woken up in a parallel universe. And then, I don't think I can go back to sleep. I may never sleep again. I crawled back into bed a few minutes later next to my partner. They're American and they have multiple intersecting queer identities. I wrapped myself tightly around them as if I was trying desperately to wedge my body between them and all the millions of people just south of the border in their country of birth who had just declared that they don't want my partner or myself as a queer and happily child-free woman to exist. Like so many of us, I'm struggling to comprehend what happened. Kamala was sweeping victorious in the polls. I was so sure she was going to win. I know that polls are often wrong, but after his 34 felony counts, apparent age-related mental and physical decline, and his increasingly obvious malignant narcissism, I thought for sure that our neighbors to the south had finally woken up to the dangers of another 4 years of Donald Trump, this time without any checks and balances on his power. I was wrong. I spent that day wrapped up in a blanket, barely getting any work done, barely able to function. I scrolled through TikTok, watching the reactions of people in my community from all over the world as they grieved for the loss of their safety and the safety of their loved ones, and shared their fears about what this would mean for the economy, for the climate, for the many conflicts that are raging around the world, and for their day-to-day lives, as Trump's victory had just emboldened the worst of the racist, homophobic, and misogynistic attitudes to come out of the closet with zero consequences. These are dark and scary times, and amidst the fear and the uncertainty, I'm left with some burning questions. How did it all go so terribly wrong? Were American voters even thinking about the implications of their vote, not just for their neighbors and communities, but for the entire world? America styles itself as the greatest country in the world, but with greatness also comes great obligation, and America has failed to live up to the responsibilities of its loftiness. Was that even weighing on voters at all as they cast their ballots for Trump, or were they only thinking of themselves? Does COVID-era depression and anxiety still run so deep that many people actively want to see the world burn? And most of all, why did so many Americans vote so hard against their own interests? Exit poll data showed that 60% of the Hispanic community in Michigan voted for Trump, and most of them were men. Similarly, 51% of white suburban women, a majority of them, voted for Trump as well. Trump is a fascist and a sexual predator. Why would women and minority communities vote for him when he's clearly a danger to anyone who isn't a straight, cisgender, rich white man?
Look, if Trump wins, things are going to be fine, okay? Not much is going to change for you in this country if Trump wins, all right? So as long as you're white, everything's going to be fine, okay? Nothing about your day-to-day is going to change as long as you are straight and white, okay? Straight and white, I mean, your day-to-day, as long as you're straight, Christian, and white, it's not really monumental. I don't know what people are panicking about. Evangelical Christian. You need to be evangelical. There's some denominations out here worrying about social justice. It's going to be a problem for you and like helping your fellow man and taking care of people. But other than that, as long as you're a straight, white, evangelical Christian, everything's going to be fine under Trump. Oh, wait, you should be a man. You definitely be a man, okay? You want to be a straight, white, evangelical Christian man, because for the women, it's going to be crazy. But as long as you're a straight, white, Christian, evangelical man, you're going to be just fine in a Trump presidency. As long as you're not a liberal. Because they're going to send the army after them. We're going to send the army. The army is coming after the liberals. But other than that, you're fine. If you're a straight, white, Christian man, conservative, nothing's going to change. Oh, yeah, but you should also be rich.
It's a question that I know a lot of you have, and the answer to that question falls along the same lines as the answer to the question of why so many women push men to be strong and tough and not show emotion, and why so many women compete with other women for male validation and treat other women badly and blame the women that their husbands and boyfriends cheat on them with instead of the person who actually cheated. The answer is internalized misogyny. And we're going to talk about it today because it's important, and it's a big reason why Trump got reelected. It's not because of uneducated rednecks or racist uncles or men who hate women. They all contributed, don't get me wrong, but they were always going to vote for Trump anyway, and had they been the only ones who did vote for him, he'd be sitting in jail right now instead of stocking the White House bathrooms with a lifetime supply of fake tanning lotion. I want to be really careful in this video essay not to point fingers at average working class people. Anger is a perfectly normal and healthy response to grief, and it's very easy right now to unleash that anger onto the people who voted for Trump. And if you have to do that, if you have to stoke that burning fire in your heart of rage and hatred towards white suburban women and members of the Hispanic community in Midwestern states and badly homeschooled Christians in the Bible Belt, then go for it. Who am I to tell you how to grieve? And if you are in that place right now, then this probably isn't the video for you at this moment. If that's you, then I invite you to click away and come back to this video later when you're ready to take a cold, hard look at some of the underlying societal norms that led to so many people voting in a far-right fascist dictator. This past summer, I found myself in the middle of a very slow period at work, so I ended up binge watching A Handmaid's Tale. I'd never seen it before. I know, I'm late to the party. And one of the things that struck me most about it was how a lot of the women seemed to be complicit in their own subjugation and abuse.
Whose fault was it, girls?
Her fault. 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 Her fault.
I actually get a lot of questions from viewers of this channel along the lines of, if patriarchy is so bad, then why do so many women support it? And the answer is complicated. A lot of the research has been done over the years to explore this question, and basically what it comes down to is a phenomenon called internalized misogyny or internalized sexism. In a nutshell, internalized misogyny is when women subconsciously project sexist ideas onto themselves and other women and men, and it's a function of living in a society that's not built by women or for women. Internalized misogyny occurs when women adopt sexist attitudes and beliefs that devalue or stereotype their own gender, often as a result of growing up in a patriarchal society. The same is true for members of any marginalized community. It's a phenomenon that also occurs in a lot of immigrant communities where some groups harbor hatred and resentment towards other groups because they perceive them to be less educated or qualified or not as assimilated to their new society. There's also sometimes a suspicion among immigrant communities of other immigrants about whether or not they came here properly, and the sentiment goes something along the lines of, I worked so hard and sacrificed so much to come here through the proper channels, and then these other immigrants just cheat and sneak their way in and are allowed to stay, and it's not fair. My ex-husband's family are immigrants who came from Africa and South Asia only about a decade ago, and that sort of fear and suspicion of other immigrant groups was something I used to hear from them a lot. They hated immigrants from other places because they bought into the fear-mongering about migrants pouring in from China and the Caribbean, and it made them feel like all their hard work and sacrifices were for nothing, and maybe there wouldn't be a place for them here in Canada. This is internalized xenophobia and racism, and it leads to things like voting in a far-right politician who promises to wipe the country clean of all the bad immigrants, which is appealing if you perceive yourself to be part of the group of good immigrants. Even though the truth is that racism is racism, and if a rich white man decides that he doesn't like immigrants, he means you too, and it's only a matter of time before you're next. And it's the same with women in patriarchal societies. When your entire life is a zero-sum game of who can get closest to power in order to be safe, other women become competition instead of being allies, comrades, and friends in the same struggle against all of our collective dispossession. A couple good examples of internalized misogyny are pick-me girls and not like other girls. If you've ever found yourself thinking something along the lines of, I'm different from other girls because I don't wear makeup or care about fashion, or I'm not like all the other girls because I like video games and I don't care if my hair gets messed up, then that's the voice of your internalized misogyny talking. And yes, we all have internalized misogyny. We all have internalized racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and ageism. It's not our fault that we have it because we live in a fundamentally sexist, racist, ableist, heterosexual, and youth-obsessed culture. We grow up surrounded by messages about how women should look and think and behave and experience desire, and what's considered normal and desirable and what isn't. Even the most progressive and inclusive among us have still internalized these messages, and it's not our fault. But it is our responsibility to unlearn them. Here are some examples of passing or quite possibly lingering thoughts you may have had at some point in your life. I'd rather have a male boss because women bosses are bitchy and controlling. I'm never going to be a mother because I don't want to be reduced to my biology. I wish queer people would stop shoving their sexuality in our faces. I'm irresponsible and lazy because I have ADHD. Young women these days are lazy because they don't cook from scratch or clean their houses properly. I'm not like other girls because I like sports and don't wear makeup. She always has a boyfriend. I've never seen her single. What's wrong with her? I need to get married and have kids before I turn 30 because after that I'll be old and no one will want me. We should hire that younger candidate because they'll be more teachable and not as stuck in their ways. All of these are examples of internalized misogyny, ableism, ageism, and homophobia. It can be really hard to notice these thoughts when they come up because we assign moral value to the things that our culture tells us are normal and good, so it can feel like the right thing to do to judge others when they don't live up to these standards due to being marginalized in some way. All of us have had thoughts like this at one time or another because they're a function of growing up in our society. If we value being good, responsible, moral human beings, then we can easily fall prey to judging ourselves and others based on what our culture tells us is good, responsible, and moral, rather than relying on our own internal compasses and values to guide us into behaviors and thoughts which are more authentic and aligned to who we actually are. This is especially true with things like neurodivergence and mental health struggles because they can so often look like what our culture deems as laziness and irresponsibility, when in fact things like ADHD, autism, OCD, and depression are serious and invisible handicaps that can make everyday things seem like monumental tasks. We live in a culture that doesn't like women, and so we unintentionally and unconsciously internalize those messages as we grow up. Messages like being too feminine means you're not going to be taken seriously, and teenage girls are silly, and if a woman is promiscuous, she must be damaged, and she has daddy issues, and she must be stupid, she's choosing to be a stay-at-home mom, and career women are bitchy and bitter and just couldn't get a man to love them, and she's a bad mom because she works too much, and she's a bad employee because she's always leaving early to pick up her kid, and you can't wear frilly dresses to the office because no one will take you seriously, and she's 35 and still single, she'd better hurry up, and on it goes. If you're a woman or a femme-presenting person and you're watching this, you're all too familiar with the ways that patriarchy damns us if we do and damns us if we don't. We all remember the monologue from Barbie.
You have to be a career woman, but also always be looking out for other people. You have to answer for men's bad behavior, which is insane, but if you point that out, you're accused of complaining. You're supposed to stay pretty for men, but not so pretty that you tempt them too much or that you threaten other women because you're supposed to be a part of the sisterhood, but always stand out. And it's too hard. It's too contradictory. And it turns out, in fact, that not only are you doing everything wrong, but also everything is your fault.
Internalized misogyny can influence how women view ourselves and other women, and if we're not being careful and mindful to unlearn these things, we can end up upholding and even defending harmful norms like toxic masculinity that actually make the world less safe for us. Toxic masculinity is the idea that traditional perceptions of what makes a real man under patriarchy are damaging and unhelpful, not only for women and queer people and everyone who isn't a cis hetero man, but also for the men themselves. Toxic masculinity reinforces the idea that men are supposed to be stoic and strong and in control of their emotions at all times, i.e. suppressing their emotions at all times, which is extremely unhealthy. The thing about emotions is that we can't actually suppress them, and if we try, it leads to all kinds of health complications, both physically and mentally. Besides the fact that we're more likely to think about and feel things that we're trying to avoid, what are we doing when we're trying really hard to not think about something? We're thinking about it. Suppressing our emotions deprives us of key information about our values, motivations, needs, and boundaries. Being able to feel our feelings helps us to know ourselves better, and when we can do that, we can have better relationships. Suppressing our emotions can also increase our risk of dying earlier. Holding back our emotions leads to stress, which leads to inflammation in the body, which is a big risk factor for cardiovascular disease and cancer. It can also lead to depression, substance abuse, increased anxiety levels, and trouble with communication and forming long-term relationships. In order to truly and authentically connect with others, we need to be able to be vulnerable, and in a society that values strength and independence, vulnerability is seen as a weakness rather than the act of courage it actually is. Men are taught from an early age that being vulnerable and expressing their emotions will make them appear weak, incompetent, and feminine. At the root of patriarchy is a deep fear of women. See my video on Xenophobia for a deeper dive on this. And a lot of what men are taught to do and think revolves around the avoidance of being perceived as feminine in any way. The common myth about men and emotions is that they're just wired differently, and that means they don't have all the same emotional needs as women. This is wildly untrue. All humans have emotional needs, regardless of their sex or gender, and telling men that they don't and shouldn't have those needs is just one way that patriarchy presents men as being somehow exempt from all the other rules that apply to everyone else. In reality, several studies have shown that human brain structures are resistant to binary expectations about gender or sex. In other words, we can tell people to think and feel certain things and behave in certain ways based on whatever sex they were assigned at birth, but if and when they conform to these expectations, it will be as a performance and not an authentic expression of who they truly are and how they truly feel. A study published in 2021 found that men's and women's emotions are clearly, consistently, and unmistakably more similar than they are different. Any perceived differences are more likely to have arisen from social constructs imposed on us from an early age. Psychologist Frederick Rabinowitz at the University of Redlands in California said that we don't train boys to have vocabulary around their emotions beyond anger. This occurs because many boys are raised to believe that deeper emotions are separate to their being, which morphs into unprocessed trauma. Being unable to identify and express your emotions is called alexithymia, and it's a condition that's common in neurodivergent folk, but it can also develop on its own as a result of being unable to access your deeper emotions for a long enough time. Individuals with alexithymia can sometimes appear to lack empathy because having this condition makes it difficult to identify your emotions and the emotions of others. Lacking empathy is an unfair label that gets slapped on autistic folks a lot because being on the spectrum can sometimes make it tricky to identify and verbalize your emotions, even though you might feel them deeply and intensely. In the case of autistic and other neurodivergent folk, it's not a lack of empathy or emotions, it's a difficulty expressing those emotions because being neurodivergent can make it tricky to communicate sometimes. But in the case of men who grow up in a patriarchal society, alexithymia can happen as a result of never being taught the language or the skills to properly communicate about their emotions, in addition to being actively cut off from feeling them. The combination of these two things can lead to difficulties with empathy, which is why so many men are unfortunately poor relationship partners. The one emotion that it is considered appropriate for men to feel and show is anger. The funny thing about this is that anger is actually a response to fear, which is an intensely vulnerable emotion to feel and express. Fear triggers our body's fight or flight response to kick in, and anger is the fight response. In the context of a hunter-gatherer being cornered by a hungry lion, feeling anger could be life-saving because it would give you the rush of adrenaline you would need to fight that lion off. Toxic masculinity is what happens when men end up over-identifying with their anger and suppressing everything else, while at the same time refusing to acknowledge or understand or engage with the deeper roots of that anger. Instead, it comes out sideways and ends up damaging themselves and others around them, and it makes them poor partners and unattractive relationship candidates to anyone who's healthy, which contributes to even more anger when they find themselves alone and rejected time after time, which leads to more anger, and the cycle continues. It's really sad. If men are not allowed to feel down to the roots of their emotions and actively encouraged to explore them, they can become dangerous to themselves and others. Therapy is great for doing that work, but under patriarchy, men are actively and implicitly discouraged from going to therapy because, of course, that would mean first admitting that they need help, which is a vulnerable thing to do, and then having to talk about their emotions to a stranger, which is another vulnerable thing to do. In heterosexual relationships, there's an expectation for men to have everything figured out for themselves and their families. This comes from the very heteronormative idea that men are supposed to be stoic, strong provider types who can handle everything with confidence and emotional toughness. This is actually detrimental to intimacy because it can result in men checking out of relational conflicts by stonewalling their partners and or preventing them from talking about their emotions with their partners, which creates distance and disconnection over time. A lot of the time, this torture is self-inflicted because it comes from a fear that their partners will lose attraction to them if they display anything that could be perceived as weakness or vulnerability. Women who have internalized misogyny may view traditional gender roles as being natural or ingrained. They might encourage men to be dominant, aggressive, and emotionally detached, seeing these traits as signs of strength. But by doing this, they're supporting the toxic aspects of masculinity, which devalue emotional expression and vulnerability in men, as I've already talked about. When women aren't allowed to fight back, when the world is set up to control and subjugate us, we're backed into a corner, and sometimes that can show up as a feeling of desperation for male validation, because being chosen by a man means that you're safe and that you'll be protected. And that man better be big and strong and tough and fresh from the fight. And that's not great for men either. It puts a lot of pressure on them and it cuts them off from any possibility of genuine love, safety, and intimacy. In A Handmaid's Tale, in Serena Waterford's flashbacks to the time before Gilead, she's always the one needling Fred to stand up, fight back, be a man.
Do you understand me, Fred? You're going to control yourself.
She frequently encourages women and men to embrace traditional gender roles and is one of the architects of Gilead's society.
I'm blessed to have a home and a husband to care for and follow.
Never mistake a woman's meekness for weakness.
Clever.
Yes, it is. It's from A Woman's Place.
My wife's book.
Serena's internalized misogyny is so strong that on some level she feels like the only way she can be safe and protected is by getting as close to power as possible. She grew up in a conservative Christian community which taught her that as a woman she's not supposed to protect and provide for herself. To do so goes directly against God, and so the only way she was able to be seen and heard is by loudly supporting and even creating a society that upholds traditional gender roles. She was able to get an education and write a book, but it was only okay for her to do those things because they were done in the service of patriarchy. Serena makes sure that she's safe and materially comfortable by aligning herself with a powerful man and by keeping other women down. But as she learns throughout the show, proximity to power is not the same thing as having power, and eventually she has to learn a few hard lessons about how men who don't give a shit about women don't give a shit about any woman.
I did it to set an example for our daughter.
So you have.
No.
There are no exceptions. She's not the exception, and neither are the white suburban women who voted for Trump.
I tried.
Society rewards women who fall in line with traditional gender roles and norms as being good. They get rewarded with perceived respect. I say perceived because in a patriarchal society, men don't really respect women at all, as evidenced by all the men who just told the whole world that they would rather endanger the health and safety of their wives and daughters and sisters and friends than see a woman be their president. Internalized misogyny can lead women to seek out male validation by aligning themselves with traditional gender roles and criticizing the women who don't fall in line. In some cases, they may actively perceive these women as being threats to their carefully constructed lives, fearing that these other bad women might seduce their husbands and steal their families. FYI, if another woman steals your husband, that man wanted to be stolen, and that whole situation is his fault, not the other woman's. Challenging gender norms often comes with a degree of social backlash, so internalized misogyny might prompt women to stick to and even reinforce traditional gender roles in order to avoid criticism, isolation, or even aggression from those around them. We can feel immense pressure to conform to these roles even when they're limiting, because sticking to them can feel safer and more socially acceptable. Women with internalized misogyny often base their self-worth on how well they embody these traditional female roles. They might think, I'm valuable because I'm a good mother, partner, homemaker, instead of seeing worth in their individuality or ambitions outside of these roles. This can lead to promoting these roles as the right or natural path for other women too. Women who base their identity around their socially prescribed feminine roles may also be tempted to police the behavior of other women to ensure that they're towing the line. This can take the form of judging other women for not making home-cooked meals every night, or for working outside the home, or for prioritizing their hobbies, careers, or personal lives. They may also feel compelled to police men's behavior to ensure that they also uphold their end of this lose-lose social bargain. Aunt Lydia in A Handmaid's Tale is a perfect example of this. She brutally polices the handmaids in her charge, holding them to impossibly high standards of obedience and deference to men and to the social norms of Gilead.
Such a selfish girl. Who killed him? Answer me, please. Whose fault was it? Huh? And why did God allow such a terrible thing to happen? Answer me. Alfred.
To teach me a lesson.
She herself is a woman and therefore a second-class citizen, but because she's been given a modicum of power and privilege in the social hierarchy, she uses that position to brutally oppress and control the women around her who have less power, framing this as loving concern.
To teach June a lesson.
When Margaret Atwood wrote A Handmaid's Tale, it was meant to be a commentary on slavery and how white women in the South brutally oppressed and segregated Black women. If we were to get into a time machine and go back to the Carolinas in 1854 and ask these plantation wives how they feel about their slaves, they would have probably told you that they love them and that God had placed them above the Black women in their homes in order to morally guide them. They would have framed their literal ownership of other women in maternal ways, just the same as conservative men frame their ownership of women in lovingly paternalistic ways.
Men are supposed to protect women from things like that. That's the job of men. Men go over to fight these battles precisely so that the women and children don't have to experience the violence and the horror.
Pause it.
That's the whole point.
No, it's not the whole point. The whole point is to further our imperialist interests and to ensure U.S. hegemony globally.
And for subjugated populations like women and BIPOC folk, adhering to socially approved morals like traditional gender roles, for example, can sometimes be the same thing as survival. How many Black women have felt immense pressure to get weaves or get their hair chemically straightened for work because of the latent racist perception that their natural hair looks unprofessional? How many women have had to work really hard to make themselves pleasing to men because otherwise they might end up being a sad old cat lady who dies alone? Internalized misogyny and racism makes us selfish. It sets life up as a zero-sum game where the goal is to get as close to power as possible so that you can be as safe as possible, even if that means you have to compete with or judge or criticize or even subjugate and oppress other women. Even though the reality is that the only way to actually be safe in a patriarchal colonialist society is to create communities of active resistance and solidarity with other marginalized people. But to do that takes work. We have to do the work of unlearning all this shit and educating ourselves about intersecting oppression because education systems are being gutted by conservatives who want us to stay ignorant, so we have to stand up and do that work ourselves. We have to, because if we don't, we end up under the thumb of megalomaniacs like Trump who want to be dictators and actually don't care about anything other than their own egos. Were any of the white suburban women who voted for Trump thinking about their queer and BIPOC sisters when they went to the polls last Tuesday? No, they weren't, because they wanted to save a few pennies on gas and they didn't want to pay taxes. Last night, my partner and I went out for dinner on our way out of the city. You may have noticed I'm not in my usual surroundings, and that's because my partner had to go out of town for the weekend to do some teaching for work. I tagged along so we could make a mini vacation out of it and find some small bit of joy in this increasingly effed up world. We decided to treat ourselves to some all-you-can-eat sushi before hitting the road because we were both in need of a little comfort food after the week we'd had. While we were waiting for a table, I saw an email in my inbox from a woman who knows me from social media. I've never met her in real life, but she saw my recent post on Instagram about queer people needing to stand strong and be visible now more than ever. She told me that even though she voted for Trump, she did not vote for hatred and bigotry. She just voted for him because she's scared of the cost of living going up and of the start of World War III. Without getting into all the obvious points about how both of those things are actually much more likely now that Trump is in office, her email highlights the thinking behind why so many white women voted for Trump. When you're raised in a society where individualism is celebrated and rewarded, why would you ever think even for a second that the ballot you're casting will have consequences for a Black woman in Toronto or a refugee trying to escape Syria or a trans kid in North Carolina? Trump and his Republican cronies ran on a platform of conservative Christian values. His sweeping victory shows just how deep these values still run and how much of a hold they still have on our society. His win has just emboldened people who hold the most disgusting, sexist, racist, and homophobic views to be loud and proud about them. America isn't my country, but I live 2 hours away from the border, and this hits close to home on so many levels. Aside from tariffs, Trump's policies are probably not going to affect me personally very much, and I'm privileged to be able to say that. What will affect me and everyone else around the world are the people in our own communities who now feel like they have permission to be open about their bigotry. For those of us who are women or queer or trans or BIPOC or some combination of all of the above, our everyday lives just got a little less safe. And it's happening already. I've been seeing some of the most disgusting and hateful comments from Trump supporters online that I won't repeat here because I don't want to give them any more airtime. I've been seeing photos of billboards in Texas that declare that women are property. I don't feel safe in my own community right now, and I have a sick and sinking feeling in my gut that it will be a long time before I feel safe again. I'm going to start wrapping up this video because I really just want to get on with my day and try to enjoy a bit of my time away, but before I end off, I want to say a few things directly to you. If you're watching this and you're a man, particularly a straight, white, cis man, I want you to think about what I've said about toxic masculinity and traditional gender roles and how they affect you. Those things might make you feel powerful and strong in the short term, but the reality is that you're not. There will always be men who are bigger, stronger, richer, and more powerful than you, and unless you happen to be Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, you too are powerless and poor. And it's not women's fault that you're disenfranchised. It's the fault of greedy rich assholes who took away your jobs and eroded your job security and refused to pay their fair share of taxes so that you can have access to healthcare and a good education. Feminism is doing nothing except trying to help you by helping you form deeper and better relationships with women and with other men so that at least you don't have to be a sad and lonely little basement dweller on top of being poor and uneducated. Subjugating women, making them your property, might make you feel temporarily powerful, but it won't actually give you any power. All that it will do is give you the opportunity to share your oppression with someone who has even less power than you. You want power? You want control? Direct your aggression and your rage where it really belongs, on Trump and his billionaire oligarch cronies who don't give a shit about you. If you're a man and you voted for Trump, you just voted to emasculate yourself even more. If you're watching this and you're a white suburban woman who voted for Trump, I'm not going to say that I hope you get exactly what you voted for because I don't wish harm on anyone. But I do hope that you realize at some point that you made a mistake and that you're able to take it in and not shame yourself for it and instead use it as an opportunity to unlearn your internalized misogyny and build solidarity with other women. I hope you realize at some point that Trump isn't going to fix the economy because he's selfish and incompetent and doesn't actually care about you. And even if he did fix the economy, I hope you realize at some point that saving a few dollars on gas isn't worth other women in your own community dying because they can't get health care or going to jail for life because they had a miscarriage. If you're watching this and you're a liberal woman or queer or trans or BIPOC or an immigrant or otherwise marginalized in some way, I am so sorry. And it's so important to keep fighting, keep being visible. The far right wants to erase us, but we're not going to let them. And the way we do that is by not hiding, by living our lives anyway, by seeking support and solidarity. On a practical level, learn how to protect yourself. My partner and I are signing up for self-defense classes so that we can protect ourselves and each other if needed. I don't want to be doing that. There are plenty of other things I'd rather be spending my time and money on, but I do recognize that it might come in handy one day. If you live in the US, stock up on mifepristone and misoprostol, which are the two medications that will terminate pregnancy. AidAccess.org is a website where you can order abortion pills online and they'll ship them to your house with comprehensive instructions on how to use them. It's safe and confidential to order from them. You don't need a prescription to order, and the cost is relatively low. Even if you're sure you won't need them because you're already pregnant or postmenopause or have had your tubes tied or an IUD put in, stock up anyway just to have them handy because other women around you might need them. AidAccess.org also provides education about abortion and abortion pills on their website, as well as education about how and where to access abortion pills in states like Florida, where terminating pregnancy after 6 weeks is illegal. I'm going to leave a link to their website in the description below, so if you need it, it's there. And spread the word about it. Tell other women where to access them and advise them to also stock up. If you live in the US and you don't want or aren't planning to have children, get an IUD put in before January 20th when Trump takes power. Most IUDs are good for at least 5 years, and some are good for up to 12 years. Do it now because after January, you might not have access to birth control if Project 2025 goes into effect. It saddens me to my core that I have to make this video. It feels dystopian and I feel helpless, like I'm watching my neighbor's house burn to the ground and there's nothing I can do about it except desperately try to keep the flames from spreading to my own house. When I binge watched A Handmaid's Tale this past summer, I never imagined that it might actually be a window into the future. I, like so many others, was so sure that Kamala would win. I was wrong. I underestimated just how deep the misogyny and racism run in America, to the point where a majority of men would rather endanger the health and well-being and lives of their daughters, wives, sisters, and friends than elect a woman of color as their president. If you watched all the way to the end of this video, thank you. If you found something useful in it, please pass it along. Share it with others. Start taking steps to unlearn your own internalized misogyny. Please, people's lives depend on it. I'll see you in the next one. Toodaloo.